The radio crackled with static electricity and barely contained panic. Major Sarah Viper Chen pressed her headset closer to her ear, the familiar weight of her flight helmet suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had in 12 years of flying. Below her, the Afghan desert stretched like a canvas of death painted in shades of brown and red. And somewhere in that maze of rocks and ravines, 8 Navy SEALs were pinned down by enemy fire with their ammunition running dangerously low. Viper 17, this is Phantom 6, came the voice through the static, strained but professional. We've got approximately 40 Taliban fighters in a U-shaped ambush. They've got us locked down in a depression about 2 clicks north of checkpoint. Charlie, we need close air support, and we need it now. Sarah's A-10 Thunderbolt II. The legendary Warthog banked hard to the left as she surveyed the battlefield below. The twin engines hummed with their characteristic whine, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Through her heads-up display, she could see the muzzle flashes erupting from the rocky outcropping where the Taliban fighters had positioned themselves. The SEALs were trapped in what appeared to be a natural bowl in the landscape, with enemy positions on 3 sides creating a killing field that would be difficult to escape. Copy that, Phantom 6. I've got eyes on your position. Can you mark your location with smoke? Negative, Viper 17. We're too low on supplies. Red smoke would just give them a better target. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. This was the kind of situation that separated the tourists from the warriors, as her instructors at the Air Force Academy had often said. But that word tourist carried a different weight for her. She'd heard it whispered behind her back more times than she cared to count, usually preceded by words like female or diversity hire, or worse. The SEALs had their own reputation for being particularly unwelcoming to outsiders, especially female pilots who they saw as playing dress-up in a man's war. She had been stationed at Bagram Air Base for 8 months now, and while she'd flown dozens of close air support missions, she'd never worked directly with this particular SEAL team. She knew their reputation, though. Phantom Team was legendary among Special Operations Forces, tight-knit group of warriors who had been operating in Afghanistan for 3 consecutive tours. Their team leader, Staff Sergeant Marcus Bulldog Rodriguez, was known for his tactical brilliance and his complete intolerance for what he considered weakness or hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very men who had likely dismissed her as a tourist were now depending on her to keep them alive. Phantom 6, I need you to describe your exact positioning relative to the enemy. I'm going to have to come in low and fast to be effective. But I need to know exactly where you are to avoid friendly fire. Roger that. We're in a natural depression, approximately 30 meters in diameter. Enemy positions are at our 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 2 o'clock, all elevated on rocky outcroppings. Distance to nearest enemy position is maybe 60 meters. Sarah's blood ran cold, 60 meters. In close air support terms, that was practically point-blank range. The standard minimum safe distance for a 10 gun runs was typically much greater. But these men didn't have the luxury of standard procedures. They needed her to thread the needle between salvation and disaster, and there would be no room for error. She had joined the Air Force 13 years ago, straight out of high school in San Francisco, where her parents had immigrated from Taiwan. When she was 5 years old, her father, Dr. James Chen, was a cardiovascular surgeon who had wanted his daughter to follow a safe, respectable path in medicine or engineering. Her mother, Linda, had been a mathematics professor who solved complex equations with the same methodical precision that Sarah now applied to calculating attack vectors and ammunition expenditure rates. Neither parent had understood their daughter's burning desire to fly. They certainly hadn't understood her decision to pursue a career in military aviation, especially in combat roles that had only recently been open to women. Her father had actually cried the day she told him she was going to pilot school, not from pride, but from fear and disappointment. "Sarah," he had said in their native Mandarin, Why do you want to put yourself in harm's way? Why can't you use your intelligence for something that builds instead of destroys? She had tried to explain that she wasn't interested in destruction for its own sake, but in protection. She wanted to be the person who stood between the innocent and those who would do them harm. She wanted to master a machine that could provide hope to those who had none and fear to those who preyed on the weak. But her parents had seen only their daughter choosing a path that seemed to lead inevitably toward violence and danger. The path to this moment had been long and filled with obstacles that her male counterparts never had to face. Flight school had been brutal, not just because of the academic and physical demands, but because she had been one of only 3 women in a class of 47. Every mistake was magnified, every success dismissed as luck or lowered standards. She had to be twice as good to be considered half as capable, and even then, some instructors seemed determined to prove that women simply didn't belong in fighter aircraft. Her call sign, Viper, had come during advanced training when she had executed a series of low-level attack runs with such precision and aggression that her squadron commander had said she struck like a snake, silent, deadly, and without warning. She had worn the name with pride, but she also knew that some people used it with a different connotation, implying that she was cold-blooded or somehow inhuman. Now, as she circled above the battlefield in Afghanistan, those years of preparation and prejudice seemed to telescope down to this single moment. 8 men who had probably never taken her seriously were about to discover exactly what kind of pilot she really was. Phantom 6, what's your ammunition status? We're down to maybe 2 magazines per man and a handful of grenades. We've been in this position for almost 40 minutes, and they're starting to move closer. I don't think we can hold them much longer. Sarah could hear the controlled desperation in the team leader's voice. These were men trained never to show fear, but she could detect the edge that came when even the most elite warriors faced the possibility of being overrun. She had to act fast, but she also had to act smart. One mistake would turn a rescue mission into a tragedy. She pulled up the digital map on her multifunction display and began calculating approach vectors. The terrain was challenging, jagged rocks and steep ravines that would make a low altitude attack run extremely dangerous. But the A-10 had been designed for exactly this kind of mission. The aircraft was built around the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a 7-barrel Gatling gun that could fire 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. It was a weapon system capable of destroying tanks, and it would make short work of Taliban fighters hiding behind rocks. But first, she needed to get close enough to use it effectively, and that meant flying lower than any sane pilot would attempt in mountainous terrain filled with enemy combatants armed with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency, adjusting trim tabs and weapon systems while her mind calculated wind speeds, target distances, and approach angles. The A-10's distinctive straight wings and twin tail engines gave it unmatched stability at low speeds and altitudes, but it also made it a relatively large and slow target compared to sleeker fighter aircraft. What it lacked in speed and maneuverability, however, it made up for in armor protection and devastating firepower. Sarah had always felt a spiritual connection to the warthog that bordered on the mystical. The aircraft seemed to respond to her thoughts as much as her control inputs, as if they had developed a symbiotic relationship over hundreds of hours of flight time. She knew exactly how the machine would behave in every conceivable situation, from high-altitude cruising to nap-of-the-earth attack runs that skimmed just above the ground. Phantom 6, I'm beginning my attack run. Keep your heads down and mark your positions by whatever means possible. I'm coming in from the south and will engage targets from left to right. Time on target in 90 seconds. Roger, Viper 17. We'll pop a flare when you're in position. Sarah pushed the stick forward and felt the familiar sensation of her stomach rising toward her, throat as the A-10 began its descent. She had performed this maneuver hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in combat, but this felt different. The stakes seemed higher, more personal somehow. Perhaps it was because she knew that the men below had probably dismissed her as a tourist before today. Or perhaps it was because she sensed that this mission would define not just their survival, but her reputation among the special operations community. As the altimeter unwound and the ground rushed up to meet her, Sarah's mind entered the zone that combat pilots called the bubble, a state of heightened awareness where time seemed to slow down and every detail became crystal clear. She could see individual rocks and scrub brush streaming past her canopy. She could make out muzzle flashes from the Taliban positions, and even spot movement among the rocks where fighters were repositioning themselves. The SEALs' position became visible as a dark shadow in the desert floor, with the telltale signs of defensive positions scraped into the earth. 8 men, America's most elite warriors, were counting on her to save their lives. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden, but also like a source of strength. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Why do you want to put yourself in harm's way?" Now she knew the answer with perfect clarity. She was here because 8 brave men needed someone willing to fly lower and risk more than anyone had a right to expect. She was here because the word tourist was about to be permanently retired. From their vocabulary, the radio crackled again. "Viper 17, we've got movement from the east. Looks like reinforcements heading our way. Whatever you're going to do, you better do it fast." Sarah's grip tightened on the stick as she prepared to find out exactly what kind of pilot she was when everything was on the line. The desert floor was rushing up at her at 350 knots. Enemy fire was beginning to arc up toward her aircraft, and somewhere in the maze of rocks below, 8 Navy SEALs were about to discover whether their tourist pilot was going to save their lives or get them all killed. Major Sarah Chen had never intended to become a warrior. Growing up in the Richmond district of San Francisco, surrounded by the fog-shrouded streets where her Taiwanese immigrant parents had built their new life, she had been the quiet girl who excelled at mathematics and spent her afternoons building model airplanes in her bedroom. Her childhood had been structured around her parents' expectations: perfect grades, violin lessons, advanced placement courses, and a predetermined path toward medical school that would make the family proud. But every afternoon, when the Marine layer lifted from the bay, she would climb onto the roof of their Victorian-era house and watch the aircraft from nearby. Airports traced silver lines across the California sky. There was something about those distant machines that called to her, in a way that molecular biology and organic chemistry never could. They represented freedom from the careful, measured existence her parents had planned for her, a chance to touch the infinite blue that stretched beyond the horizon. Her bedroom walls had been covered with posters of aircraft instead of pop stars, and her bookshelf was filled with biographies of pilots instead of romance novels. She read about Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, about the Tuskegee Airmen fighting fascism in the skies over Europe, and about the handful of women who had broken barriers in military aviation. Each story fed a growing conviction that she was meant to do more than follow the safe path her parents had outlined. The transformation from dreamer to pilot had begun during her sophomore year at UC Berkeley, where she was dutifully pursuing a pre-med track that left her feeling empty. Despite her success, she had been walking across campus when she noticed a recruiting booth for the Air Force, complete with a display model of an F-16 fighting Falcon and a female pilot in flight suit answering questions from curious students. Captain Maria Vasquez had been everything Sarah's parents were not: confident, adventurous, and completely comfortable with uncertainty. She spoke about flying as both a science and an art, describing the complex calculations required for aerial combat, while also conveying the pure joy of slipping through clouds at twice the speed of sound. More importantly, she had looked directly into Sarah's eyes and said something that changed the trajectory of her entire life. "You've got the look," Captain Vasquez had said after. Sarah had peppered her with technical questions about avionics systems and weapons targeting. "I can always spot someone who's meant to fly. You're not here because you're curious about the military. You're here because something inside you knows you belong in the sky." That conversation had led to sleepless nights, difficult discussions with her parents, and ultimately the decision to switch her major to aerospace engineering while simultaneously entering the Air Force ROTC program. Her parents had been devastated. Her father had stopped speaking to her for 3 months, and her mother had cried every time Sarah's chosen career came up in conversation. "We came to America so you could have opportunities we never had," her mother had said through tears. "But we wanted you to have a safe life, a stable life. Why are you choosing to put yourself in danger?" Sarah had tried to explain that safety was an illusion, that stability was something she would have to create for herself rather than inherit from their expectations. But she couldn't make them understand the fire that had been lit inside her the moment she realized she could spend her life mastering machines, capable of defying gravity and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The path through pilot training had been more difficult than anything she had experienced in academic life. Flight school was designed to push candidates beyond their physical and mental limits, to identify those who could perform under pressure and those who would crack when lives depended on their decisions. The academic coursework was challenging enough: aerodynamics, meteorology, navigation, weapon systems, but the real test came in the cockpit, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Sarah had discovered that she possessed an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that couldn't be taught in textbooks. She could feel when an aircraft was approaching a stall before the instruments indicated danger. She could sense the exact moment to pull out of a dive or execute a turn that would put her in perfect position for a weapons delivery. Her instructors had been impressed by her technical proficiency, but they had been amazed by her natural ability to think in 3 dimensions while managing multiple systems simultaneously. But technical skill hadn't been enough to overcome the cultural barriers that existed in military aviation. She had been one of only 4 women in her pilot training class, and 2 of them had washed out before graduation. The remaining women had formed an unofficial support network, but they had also been careful not to appear too close, lest they be accused of weakness or excessive emotionality. The male students had ranged from supportive to openly hostile, with most falling somewhere in the middle: polite but distant, professional but never quite accepting her as an equal. She had learned to navigate the careful balance between proving her competence and avoiding the perception that she was trying too hard or being overly aggressive. It was a tightrope that her male counterparts never had to walk. Her first operational assignment had been to Davis Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where she had joined the 354th Fighter Squadron and begun flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Warthog had initially seemed like a consolation prize compared to the sleeker F-16s and F-15s that some of her classmates were flying. But she had quickly fallen in love with the aircraft's unique personality and capabilities. The L-10 was not designed for air-to-air combat or high-altitude bombing missions. It was built specifically for close air support, flying low, slow, and vulnerable in order to provide direct assistance to ground forces engaged in combat. It required a different kind of courage than other forms of military aviation, a willingness to deliberately place yourself in danger in order to help soldiers and Marines who were fighting for their lives on the ground. Sarah had found her calling in that mission. She loved the precision required to deliver ordnance close to friendly forces without causing civilian casualties. She loved the immediate feedback from ground controllers, who could tell her exactly how her actions were affecting the battle. Most of all, she loved knowing that her skills and courage could be the difference between soldiers coming home safely and their families receiving folded flags. Her reputation had grown steadily over her first few years of flying. She had deployed to Iraq twice and Afghanistan once, accumulating combat hours and building relationships with forward air controllers and special operations teams who requested her by-call sign when they needed close air support. She had developed a reputation for being willing to fly lower and closer than most pilots, for taking calculated risks that other aviators considered too dangerous. But she had also remained an outsider in many ways. The special operations community was particularly insular, and she knew that many SEAL, Delta Force, and Ranger teams viewed female pilots with skepticism. They questioned whether women had the physical strength to handle high-G maneuvers, whether they had the mental toughness to make life-and-death decisions under fire, and whether they could be trusted to risk everything to save fellow warriors. She had heard the whispers and seen the eye rolls when she walked into briefing rooms. She had endured the casual comments about political correctness and social experiments that were never quite direct enough to file complaints about, but were clear enough to understand. Most painful of all, she had been excluded from the informal networks and relationships that determined which pilots got the most challenging and rewarding missions. The word tourist had begun following her during her second deployment to Afghanistan. It had started as a joke among some Air Force pilots, a way of describing aviators who seemed more interested in checking boxes and building careers than in genuinely supporting ground forces. But Sarah knew that when it was applied to her, it carried additional meaning. She wasn't just a tourist in the combat zone. She was a tourist in military aviation itself, a visitor who was tolerated but never truly welcomed. The accusation stung because it was so far from her own understanding of her motivations and commitment. She had turned down opportunities for staff assignments and career-advancing positions because she wanted to keep flying combat missions. She had volunteered for additional deployments and requested assignments to the most dangerous areas of operation. She had studied tactics and weapons systems with an obsessive attention to detail that impressed even her most demanding instructors. But none of that seemed to matter when it came to earning the respect of the special operations community. They measured commitment not in flight hours or mission success rates, but in willingness to take risks that bordered on the suicidal. They wanted to know that their air support would come through even when the odds were impossible and the mission seemed hopeless. Today, circling above 8 trapped Navy SEALs in the mountains of Afghanistan, Sarah realized that she was finally going to have the opportunity to prove exactly who she was. The men below her were the epitome of the special operations community that had kept her at arm's length for so many years. Their survival depended entirely on her willingness to fly lower and risk more than any reasonable person would attempt. As she began her attack run, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. All the years of training, all the missions that had prepared her for this moment, all the doubts and criticisms and whispered comments about tourists, everything came down to the next few minutes and her ability to thread a 30mm cannon between enemy positions and friendly forces with a margin of error measured in meters. Rather than hundreds of yards, her hands moved across the cockpit controls with the fluid precision of a concert pianist, adjusting weapon settings and flight parameters, while her mind calculated approach angles and target priorities. The A-10 responded to her inputs like an extension of her own body, banking and descending with smooth precision as the ground rushed up to meet them. This was what she had been born to do. This was why she had endured years of skepticism and exclusion. This was the moment when she would finally show the special operations community exactly what kind of pilot they had been calling a tourist. The first anti-aircraft fire streaked past Sarah's canopy like deadly fireworks, close enough that she could see the bright orange tracers burning trails through the morning air. The Taliban fighters had spotted her incoming A-10 and were adjusting their positions, some redirecting their fire from the trapped SEALs toward her aircraft while others maintained pressure on the Americans pinned down below. Viper 1-7. "You've got multiple shooters tracking you from the ridgeline," came the urgent voice of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez through her headset. "They've got what looks like a ZPU-23 up there. Twin-barrel anti-aircraft gun." Sarah's blood ran cold. The ZPU-23 was a Soviet-era anti-aircraft weapon that fired 23mm shells, capable of shredding an A-10's armor if they found their mark. While the Warthog was famous for its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying, there were limits to what even the most robust aircraft could survive. A direct hit from that weapon system would turn her titanium bathtub cockpit into a coffin, but she was committed now, screaming toward the target at low altitude with enemy fighters adjusting their aim every second she remained in their sights. Turning away would mean abandoning the SEALs to almost certain death, and Sarah had not spent 13 years preparing for this moment, just to cut and run when the shooting started. She jinked hard to the left as another stream of tracers lit up the sky where her aircraft had been milliseconds before. The G forces pressed her down into her ejection seat as the A-10 responded to her control inputs with the agility of an aircraft designed to survive in the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Her vision grayed at the edges, but her hands remained steady on the controls. "Phantom 6, I need that flare now." "Roger," popping red smoke. The red flare burst like a flower of fire against the brown landscape, marking the exact position of the SEAL team and giving Sarah the reference point she needed to begin her attack run. She could see the enemy positions now with crystal clarity, muzzle flashes erupting from behind rocks and boulders. In a rough horseshoe pattern around the Americans' position, Sarah lined up her attack run with the precision of a surgeon, her finger hovering over the trigger for the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. The weapon system was essentially a flying gun. The A-10 had been built around the massive 7-barrel Gatling gun, which meant that when she pulled the trigger, she would essentially become a living weapon capable of delivering 30mm depleted uranium rounds at a rate of nearly 4,000 per minute. But she had to get closer. Much closer than any manual recommended. Closer than any instructor had ever suggested was prudent. The SEALs were pinned down only 60 meters from the nearest enemy position, which meant she would have to place her cannon fire with surgical precision while flying at over 300 knots through a maze of mountains and anti-aircraft fire. "Phantom 6, keep your heads down. Gun run in 5 seconds." Sarah pulled the trigger. The GAU-8 erupted with a sound like the devil's own chainsaw, a mechanical roar that could be heard from miles across the desert. The depleted uranium rounds struck the rocky outcropping where Taliban fighters had been positioned and turned stone into powder, metal into shrapnel, and human beings into memories. The cannon's recoil actually slowed the A-10's forward momentum, a testament to the raw power of the weapon system that formed the aircraft's heart. But even as the first position was obliterated, Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from 2 other locations. The Taliban fighters were well-trained and disciplined, maintaining their attack on the SEALs even as their comrades were being destroyed by 30mm cannon fire. This was not going to be resolved with a single gun run. "Good hits, Viper." 1-7. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of surprise and something that might have been respect. "But we've still got shooters at our 10 and 2 o'clock positions." Sarah pulled back on the stick and began climbing for altitude, her mind already calculating the geometry for a second attack run. But the Taliban fighters had learned from her first pass, and the anti-aircraft fire was intensifying. She could see multiple muzzle flashes tracking her aircraft as it climbed away from the battlefield, and the radio frequency was alive with the chatter of enemy fighters coordinating their defensive efforts. This was where the mission would succeed or fail. Sarah realized the first attack run had been about proving she could deliver ordnance with precision under fire. But the second run would require her to fly back into a hornet's nest of enemy fighters, who who were now fully alert and actively hunting her aircraft. Many pilots would have called for backup or requested permission to abort the mission after encountering such heavy anti-aircraft fire. Sarah could hear something in Rodriguez's voice that she had never heard before when special operations personnel talked to her genuine respect for her capabilities and trust in her commitment to the mission. The word tourist seemed to have evaporated from his vocabulary somewhere between her first gun run and the destruction of the Taliban position that had been threatening to overrun his team's defensive perimeter. She banked hard to the right and began setting up for her second attack run, this time approaching from the east to avoid the anti-aircraft gun that was tracking her movements from the ridgeline. The new approach vector would be more challenging. It required her to thread between two mountain peaks while descending rapidly to attack altitude, but it would also give her the element of surprise. Phantom 6, I'm coming around for run number 2. This time I'm approaching from your 3 o'clock position. Make sure your people stay low. Roger that, Viper. We've got eyes on more bad guys moving toward us from the north. Looks like they're trying to flank us while you're making your runs. Sarah felt her jaw clench with frustration. This was the nightmare scenario that every close air support pilot dreaded, a dynamic battlefield where enemy positions kept changing while friendly forces remained pinned down and unable to maneuver. She was essentially playing a deadly game of whack-a-mole, attacking enemy positions that were constantly shifting while trying to avoid hitting the very people she was trying to save. Her second gun run was even more aggressive than the first, skimming so low over the rocky terrain that her landing gear almost scraped the mountain peaks. She could see individual Taliban fighters scrambling for new positions as her aircraft screamed toward them, some firing wildly at her aircraft while others tried to take cover behind inadequate rocks and boulders. The GAU-8 cannon spoke again, its distinctive sound echoing off the canyon walls as depleted uranium rounds tore through the enemy position at her 10 o'clock. She could see the impacts walking across the rocky outcropping like a deadly line of explosions, each round capable of penetrating armor or reducing human beings to component parts. But as she pulled up from her second attack run, Sarah realized that the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Her fuel gauge showed that she was already below the level typically required for safe return to base, and her ammunition counter indicated that she had expended nearly half of her cannon rounds. More concerning was the radio chatter she was picking up from other aircraft in the area. There were reports of additional Taliban fighters moving toward the SEAL team's position, and the window for extraction was closing rapidly. Viper 1-7. This is Phantom 6. We've got movement from multiple directions now. Looks like at least 60 fighters converging on our position. How much gas you got left? It was a question that cut to the heart of every close air support mission. The balance between providing adequate fire support and maintaining enough fuel reserves to return safely to base. Sarah looked at her fuel gauges and made a calculation that would have horrified her instructors at flight school. She had enough fuel for perhaps 2 more attack runs before she reached the point where her safe return to Bagram would become questionable. But she also knew that the 8 SEALs below her would be dead long before a replacement aircraft could arrive on station. The Taliban fighters were closing in from multiple directions, and the Americans were running dangerously low on ammunition. This was the moment of decision that defined a pilot's character. The choice between personal safety and mission accomplishment, between following procedures and saving lives. Phantom 6, I've got enough for 2 more runs. After that, we'll need to figure out extraction. Roger that. We're working on getting a helicopter in here, but it's going to take time. Think you can keep the bad guys off us until then? Sarah looked down at the battlefield below, where muzzle flashes were erupting from at least 6 different positions as Taliban fighters maneuvered for better firing positions. She could see the red smoke from the SEAL team's position beginning to dissipate in the wind and she could imagine the 8 men huddled in their improvised defensive positions, counting their remaining ammunition and wondering if their tourist pilot was going to stick around long enough to get them out of this mess. The radio crackled with a new voice, one she didn't recognize, but which carried the unmistakable authority of senior leadership. Viper 17, this is Colonel Harrison at Bagram. We're monitoring your fuel status and tactical situation. You are authorized to break off and return to base if conditions become untenable. It was a Lifeline official. Permission to abandon the mission if she determined that her own survival was in jeopardy. Many pilots would have taken the offer without hesitation, especially given the deteriorating tactical situation and the fuel constraints that were making her situation more precarious with every passing minute. But, as Sarah looked down at the battlefield, she realized that the question wasn't whether she could safely return to base. The question was whether she could live with herself if she abandoned 8 Navy SEALs to their fate simply because the mission had become more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Negative, Colonel. Phantom 6 still needs me here. I'll call you when we're ready for extraction. There was a long pause before Colonel Harrison's voice came back over the radio. Roger that, Viper 17. We'll have search and rescue standing by in case you need them. Sarah knew that the Colonel's offer of search and rescue support was both a vote of confidence and a tacit acknowledgement that her chances of surviving the next phase of the mission were far from certain. But she also knew that somewhere below her, 8 of America's most elite warriors were counting on her to prove that she was something more than a tourist playing at being a combat pilot. She banked the A-10 into position for her 3rd attack run, knowing that she was about to find out exactly what kind of pilot she was when everything was on the line. The fuel gauges were dropping toward the red zone, anti-aircraft fire was intensifying, and enemy fighters were closing in on the SEAL team's position from multiple directions. But Major Sarah Viper Chen had not spent 13 years preparing for this moment just to turn away when the mission became difficult. The word tourist was about to be permanently erased from the vocabulary of every special operations warrior who survived the next few minutes. The 3rd gun run was different from the first 2 in ways that would be debated in military aviation circles for years to come. Instead of the textbook high-speed passes that Sarah had executed earlier, she made a decision that violated every principle of safe close air support operations. She slowed the A-10 to just above stall speed and descended to an altitude that put her aircraft within range of small arms fire. At 150 knots and less than 200 feet above the ground, the Warthog became a flying gun platform rather than a high-speed attack aircraft. Sarah could see individual Taliban fighters scrambling for cover, could make out the details of their weapons and equipment, could even see the expressions on their faces as they realized that the American pilot was doing something that bordered on the suicidal. But the unconventional approach also gave her something that high-speed gun runs could never provide. Time. Time to identify targets with absolute precision. Time to adjust her aim between bursts. Time to walk her cannon fire exactly where it needed to go, without risking the lives of the men she was trying to protect. The GAU-8 cannon fired in controlled bursts as Sarah held the A-10 in what fighter pilots called the envelope of death, slow enough to be vulnerable to ground fire, low enough to be hit by rocket-propelled grenades, but perfectly positioned to deliver devastating accurate fire on enemy positions that were threatening the SEAL team. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, filled with something between awe and disbelief. Viper 17, you are danger close to everything out here. How are you keeping that bird in the air? The answer was that Sarah had pushed the A-10 beyond its normal operating envelope, using her intimate knowledge of the aircraft's capabilities to maintain controlled flight at speeds and altitudes that would have been impossible for a less experienced pilot. She was essentially hand-flying the aircraft through a 3-dimensional maze of enemy Fire while simultaneously operating the most complex weapons system in the Air Force inventory. But her unorthodox tactics were working. The Taliban fighters, accustomed to American aircraft that attacked at high speed from safe altitudes, were completely unprepared for a pilot who was willing to fly slow and low enough to engage in what amounted to aerial close combat. Her cannon fire was finding its mark with surgical precision, eliminating enemy positions without endangering the trapped Americans. It was during her fourth gun run that everything changed. Sarah was lining up on a machine gun nest that had been pouring fire onto the SEAL team's position when she saw the RPG launch from a position she hadn't identified. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked toward her aircraft like a deadly comet, and she had perhaps 2 seconds to react before impact. She threw the A-10 into a violent right turn that stressed the airframe beyond its design specifications. Feeling the aircraft shudder and complain as forces exceeded normal operational limits. The RPG passed so close to her left engine that she could feel the heat through the cockpit glass, and she knew that she had just survived what should have been a mission-ending hit. But as she pulled out of the emergency maneuver, Sarah realized that her aircraft was no longer responding normally. Warning lights were illuminating across her instrument panel, and she could feel vibrations through the control stick that suggested serious damage to her flight control systems. The RPG hadn't scored a direct hit, but its proximity detonation had sent shrapnel through critical systems. Viper 1-7, we saw that hit. What's your status? Sarah scanned her instruments rapidly, prioritizing the information that would determine whether she could continue the mission or needed to attempt an emergency landing at the nearest base. Her left engine was showing decreased power output, her hydraulic pressure was dropping steadily, and her flight control system was displaying caution warnings that indicated potential control surface damage. Any reasonable pilot would have declared an in-flight emergency and headed for the nearest runway. The A-10 was designed to survive battle damage, but it wasn't invincible, and Sarah could feel the aircraft fighting her control inputs in ways that suggested serious structural problems. Below her, the 8 Navy SEALs were still pinned down and still taking fire from multiple directions. Her damaged aircraft was the only thing standing between them and being overrun by Taliban fighters, who were now closing to within 50 meters of their defensive positions. The choice was between her personal safety and their survival, between following procedures and accepting consequences. Phantom 6, I'm still operational. How many bad guys are left? You've got to be kidding me, Viper. We can see smoke coming from your bird. You need to get out of here. Negative. Answer the question. How many shooters are still active? There was a pause before Rodriguez's voice came back, and Sarah could hear something new in his tone, something that sounded like respect mixed with disbelief. We've got maybe 8 to 10 fighters left, concentrated in 2 positions. But Viper, you've done enough. We can hold them until backup arrives. Sarah looked at her fuel gauges and realized that she was already well into her reserve supply. Even if her aircraft was undamaged, she was approaching the point where a safe return to Bagram would require immediate departure. With battle damage reducing her engine efficiency and potential control problems that could worsen at any moment, continuing the mission was essentially a decision to trade her life for theirs. But she also knew that holding until backup arrives was military speak for fighting to the death with whatever ammunition we have left. The nearest helicopter was still 20 minutes away, and the SEALs had been in contact for over an hour. They were down to their last magazines, and 8 to 10 Taliban fighters were more than enough to overrun their position. Phantom 6, I'm going to make one more run on those positions. After that, you'll have to hold them with what you've got. Viper 1-7, this is Colonel Harrison. I'm ordering you to return to base immediately. We cannot afford to lose both. You and that aircraft. Sarah felt a moment of clarity that seemed to slow time itself. She could follow the colonel's order and live with the knowledge that 8 SEALs had died because she had chosen personal safety over mission accomplishment. Or she could complete the mission and accept the consequences, whatever they might be. Her father's face flashed through her mind. Dr. James Chen, the cardiovascular surgeon who had wanted his daughter to pursue a safe, respectable career in medicine. He had never understood her need to fly, her desire to put herself in harm's way for people she had never met. But she realized now that her choice had never really been about flying or fighting or proving herself to skeptical colleagues. It had been about the moment when someone's life depended on her willingness to risk everything, and she had to decide who she really was. "Colonel, respectfully, I'm going to have to disregard that order. Phantom 6 still needs me here." The radio silence that followed her statement stretched for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in combat time. Sarah could imagine the conversations taking place in the command center at Bagram, the calculations of cost versus benefit, the political implications of losing both a pilot and an expensive aircraft for the sake of 8 soldiers who had known the risks when they volunteered for special operations. But she could also hear the sound of gunfire intensifying below her, could see the muzzle flashes getting closer to the SEAL team's position, could visualize 8 of America's most elite warriors making their final stand in a rocky depression in the mountains of Afghanistan. Viper 17. Colonel Harrison's voice carried the weight of command authority and personal concern. "Are you sure about this?" "Affirmative, Colonel. These men are counting on me." What happened next would be studied in military academies and discussed in aviation circles for decades to come. Sarah pushed her damaged A-10 into a final attack run that violated every principle of aircraft survivability and pilot safety. Flying at less than 100 feet above the ground with battle damage that was worsening by the minute, she brought the Warthog's cannon to bear on the remaining Taliban positions with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, but it was. During this final run, that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez did something unprecedented in his 12 years of special operations experience. As Sarah's aircraft screamed overhead, pouring cannon fire onto the enemy positions that were threatening to overrun his team, he grabbed his radio and broadcast a message that would echo through the special operations community for years to come. All stations, this is Phantom 6. I want everyone to know that we've got a pilot up here who just saved our lives. Major Sarah Chen, callsign Viper 17, just flew repeated gun runs in a damaged aircraft to keep us alive. This woman is not a tourist. She's a goddamn warrior, and I would fly with her anywhere, anytime. The radio frequency exploded with voices as other aircraft in the area picked up Rodriguez's transmission. Fighter pilots, helicopter crews, forward air controllers, and command personnel. Dozens of military aviators heard the SEAL team leader's unsolicited testimony about the female A-10 pilot who had risked everything to save his team. But Sarah was too focused on her aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior to fully process the significance of what had just happened. Her left engine was now producing barely 50% power. Her hydraulic system was failing, and she could feel the A-10 wanting to roll to the left despite her control inputs. The aircraft was dying around her, and she was still 50 miles from the nearest runway. "Phantom 6, that's all I've got. I need to try to get this bird home." "Roger, Viper 17. The LZ is clear. You saved our lives today." As Sarah pointed the damaged A-10 toward Bagram Air Base, she realized that something fundamental had changed during the past hour. She had started the mission as a pilot whom the special operations community tolerated but never fully accepted. She was ending it as someone who had earned their respect through actions rather than words, through willingness to sacrifice rather than mere technical competence. The flight back to base was a masterclass in emergency procedures and pilot skill. Sarah had to constantly adjust her control inputs to compensate for the aircraft's battle damage, nursing the failing hydraulic system and coaxing maximum performance from her damaged left engine. She declared an in-flight emergency and received priority handling from air traffic control. But she knew that her chances of reaching the runway were far from certain. It was during this flight that she began receiving radio calls from other pilots in the area, messages of support and encouragement from aviators who had heard Rodriguez's broadcast and wanted to express their admiration for her actions. Fighter pilots who had never spoken to her before were offering to escort her damaged aircraft back to base. Helicopter crews were volunteering to attempt a rescue if she was forced to eject over hostile territory. But more significantly, she was hearing from special operations personnel who had worked with her before but had never fully accepted her as one of their own. Forward air controllers who had previously treated her with professional politeness were now expressing genuine respect for her commitment to the mission. SEAL team leaders who had once questioned her capabilities were volunteering to work with her on future operations. The word tourist seemed to have been permanently erased from their vocabulary. Sarah managed to bring the damaged A-10 back to Bagram Air Base, executing a landing that required every bit of her skill and experience to compensate for the aircraft's compromised flight characteristics. As she taxied off the runway with emergency vehicles following her aircraft, she realized that she had accomplished something more significant than simply completing a successful close air support mission. She had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that her place in military aviation was not the result of political correctness or social engineering. She belonged in the cockpit of a combat aircraft because she possessed the skill, courage, and commitment necessary to succeed in the most demanding environment that military aviation could provide. Colonel Harrison was waiting for her when she climbed out of the cockpit, his face reflecting the mixture of relief and admiration that she had never seen from senior leadership before. Behind him stood a group of pilots and ground crew personnel who had gathered to welcome her back from what everyone knew had been a mission that should have killed her. But it was the message waiting for her in the Squadron Operations Center that truly marked the significance of what had happened during her mission. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had submitted an official commendation request, recommending her for the Distinguished Flying Cross and requesting that she be permanently assigned as the primary close air support pilot for his SEAL team. The recommendation included a statement that would become legendary within the special operations community. Major Chen demonstrated courage, skill, and commitment to mission accomplishment that exceeded the highest standards of military aviation. She risked her life repeatedly to save the lives of my team members, and she has earned the respect and trust of every special operations warrior who had the privilege of working with her today. She is not a tourist. She is a warrior. 6 months after the mission that nearly cost her life, Major Sarah Chen found herself standing in front of a room filled with some of the most elite warriors in the American military. The Special Operations Command briefing room at MacDill Air Force Base was normally reserved for planning the most sensitive missions, but today it was hosting something unprecedented, a joint training seminar where SEAL teams, Delta Force operators, and Air Force pilots would learn integrated close air support tactics from the woman they had once dismissed as a tourist. The transformation had not happened overnight. In the weeks following her emergency landing at Bagram, Sarah had found herself at the center of a controversy that divided military aviation along gender lines. Some senior officers argued that her decision to disregard direct orders from Colonel Harrison set a dangerous precedent that could encourage other pilots to take unnecessary risks. Others maintained that her actions represented exactly the kind of initiative and courage that the military needed to cultivate in its combat leaders. The debate had been settled not by committees or review boards, but by the special operations community itself. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's commendation request had been endorsed by every SEAL team that had worked with female pilots, and similar recommendations had begun flowing in from Delta Force, Rangers, and other elite units. The message was clear. The special operations community wanted to work with pilots who demonstrated Sarah's level of commitment to mission accomplishment. Regardless of gender, the Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony had been a watershed moment. When General Patricia Morrison, the first female four-star general in Air Force history, had pinned the medal on Sarah's uniform, she had done so in front of an audience that included not only senior Air Force leadership, but also representatives from every special operations unit in the American military. Major Chen, General Morrison had said during her remarks, "You have demonstrated that courage is not determined by gender, that skill is not limited by physical characteristics, and that the warrior spirit can exist in anyone who chooses to cultivate it. You have earned your place among America's finest combat pilots, not through political accommodation, but through performance under fire." But the real validation had come from the men whose lives she had saved. The 8 members of Phantom Team had requested permission to attend the ceremony, and their presence in dress uniforms at the front of the audience had sent a message that resonated throughout the military aviation community. These were not men who offered their respect lightly, and their public endorsement of Sarah's capabilities carried more weight than any official recognition. Rodriguez himself had been invited to speak at the ceremony, and his remarks had been both simple and devastating to anyone who still questioned Sarah's place in military aviation. 6 months ago, my team was pinned down by enemy fire in the mountains of Afghanistan, he had said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. We were out of ammunition, outnumbered, and facing almost certain death. Major Chen flew repeated attack runs in a damaged aircraft to save our lives, risking her own life to ensure that we could come home to our families. She didn't do this because she had to. She did it because that's who she is. She's a warrior, and I would follow her into any battle, anywhere, anytime. The standing ovation that followed Rodriguez's remarks had lasted nearly 5 minutes, and Sarah had realized that something fundamental had shifted in how the military aviation community viewed her. Capabilities and commitment. That the changes in her professional life had been immediate and dramatic. Instead of being assigned to routine training missions or low-priority close air support requests, she found herself specifically requested by special operations units planning their most challenging missions. SEAL teams, Delta Force operators, and Ranger battalions were asking for her by name, and mission planners were building operations around her unique combination of technical skill and tactical aggressiveness. Her reputation had spread beyond the special operations community. Fighter pilots who had once viewed A-10 pilots as second-class citizens now sought her out for advice on close air support tactics. Military aviation schools were inviting her to speak to classes of future pilots about decision-making under pressure and the ethics of mission accomplishment versus personal safety. But perhaps most significantly, a new generation of female pilots was emerging who saw Sarah's example as proof that they could succeed in combat aviation without compromising their principles or apologizing for their presence. Young women entering pilot training were citing her as inspiration, and female aviators already serving in operational units were finding that their male colleagues were more willing to judge them on their performance rather than their gender. Training seminar at MacDill was the culmination of these changes. For 3 days, Sarah had been leading discussions about close air support tactics, aircraft survivability, and the psychological factors that influenced pilot decision-making. In combat situations, the audience included some of the most experienced combat aviators and special operations personnel in the American military, and their questions were both challenging and respectful. On the final day of the seminar, during a panel discussion about future developments in close air support, a young Navy SEAL lieutenant raised his hand and asked a question that brought the entire room to silence. "Ma'am, there are still some people who say that allowing women in combat aviation is a social experiment that compromises mission effectiveness. What would you say to those people?" Sarah looked out at the audience and saw faces that represented every branch of the American military. Some were men who had initially been skeptical of her capabilities, but had been convinced by her performance. Others were women who were fighting their own battles for acceptance and recognition. All of them were waiting to hear how she would respond to a question that went to the heart of ongoing debates about gender integration in combat roles. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium, "I would say that mission effectiveness is not determined by the gender of the person executing the mission. It's determined by their skill, their training, their commitment, and their willingness to risk everything when lives are on the line. The 8 SEALs whose lives I helped save 6 months ago didn't care that their close air support was being provided by a woman. They cared that someone was willing to fly low enough and risk enough to keep them alive." She paused and looked directly at Rodriguez, who was sitting in the front row with the other members of his team. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called me a warrior that day, and that's the only label that matters. Not female pilot, not diversity hire, not social experiment. Warrior. Because at the end of the day, that's what this job requires, people who are willing to fight for something bigger than themselves." The applause that followed was not the polite acknowledgement typical of military briefings. It was the genuine recognition of people who understood exactly what she had accomplished and what it meant for the future of American military aviation. After the seminar concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by young pilots, both male and female, who wanted to talk about career paths, training opportunities, and the challenges of earning respect in competitive military environments. She realized that her role had evolved beyond simply flying combat missions. She had become a mentor and example for a new generation of aviators who would shape the future of American military aviation. But it was a private conversation with Rodriguez that evening that truly illustrated how much had changed since that day in the mountains of Afghanistan. "You know," he said as they sat in the officers' club overlooking Tampa Bay, "my team has a tradition. When someone saves our lives, we make them an honorary member of the team. We've never done it for a pilot before, and we've certainly never done it for someone who wasn't a SEAL." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object that Sarah recognized as a SEAL team coin, a tradition in special operations units where members carried commemorative coins that represented their unit identity and shared experiences. "This coin has been carried by every member of Phantom Team for the past 5 years, Rodriguez continued. "It's been with us through 3 deployments and more missions than I can count. We want you to have it. Not because you're a female pilot or because we're trying to be politically correct, but because you've earned it. You're one of us now." Sarah accepted the coin with a sense of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent 13 years working to earn the respect of the special operations community, and this simple gesture represented validation that could not be achieved through any amount of official recognition or media attention. "Thank you," she said simply. "This means more to me than you know." "It should," Rodriguez replied, "because it means that whenever you need backup, whenever you're facing something that seems impossible, you've got 8 SEALs who will drop everything to help you out. That's what family does." As Sarah flew back to her duty station the next day, she reflected on how profoundly her life and career had changed since that morning over the mountains of Afghanistan. She had started that mission as an outsider fighting for acceptance in a community that viewed her with skepticism. She was ending this chapter of her career as a respected member of that community, with opportunities and responsibilities that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. But more importantly, she had proven something to herself that was far more valuable than professional recognition. She had discovered that when everything was on the line, when lives depended on her willingness to risk everything, she had the courage and skill necessary to succeed. The word tourist had been permanently erased from her vocabulary and from the vocabulary of everyone who worked with her. She was Major Sarah Viper Chen, United States Air Force, combat pilot, and warrior. And she was exactly where she belonged. 3 years later, Jennifer Phoenix Martinez adjusted her flight helmet and looked out across the flight line at Bagram Air Base, where 6A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft sat ready for their morning missions. As the newest pilot in the 354th Fighter Squadron, she was still learning the rhythms and traditions of close air support operations, but she had already heard the stories about the legendary mission that had changed everything for female pilots in combat aviation. "You nervous?" asked Captain Mike Gunner Thompson, her wingman for today's training mission. "Maybe a little," Jennifer admitted. "It's hard not to think about Major Chen when you're flying the same aircraft from the same base where she made history." Mike nodded understandingly. Sarah Chen's mission had become required study material at pilot training school, not just as an example of exceptional airmanship, but as a case study in tactical decision-making under pressure. Every pilot in the Air Force knew the story of how she had flown repeated gun runs in a damaged aircraft to save 8 Navy SEALs, and every female pilot saw her as proof that gender was irrelevant when it came to combat effectiveness. "She set the bar pretty high," Mike said. "But from what I've heard, she's still setting it higher." That was certainly true. Colonel Sarah Chunshi had been promoted twice in the 3 years since her Distinguished Flying Cross mission was now serving as the commander of the 355th Training Squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, where she was responsible for training the next generation of A-10 pilots. Her squadron had the highest graduation rate and the best mission readiness scores in Air Combat Command, and pilots who trained under her leadership were specifically requested by Special Operations units around the world, but her influence extended far beyond pilot training. She served on multiple Pentagon committees focused on integrating women into combat roles, and her research on stress management and decision-making under pressure had been published in military aviation journals. More significantly, she had become an unofficial mentor to female pilots throughout the Air Force, offering guidance and support to women facing the same challenges she had encountered earlier in her career. 5 years later, Brigadier General Sarah Chen stood at the podium in the Air Force Academy's Cadet Chapel, looking out at an audience of nearly 1,000 people who had gathered to hear her deliver the keynote address at the Academy's annual Military Aviation Symposium. In the front rows sat cadets who would soon begin their own journeys toward becoming Air Force pilots, and their faces reflected the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that she remembered from her own academy days. 15 years ago, she began, "I was sitting where you are now, wondering if I had what it takes to succeed in military aviation. I was a young woman entering a field that had been dominated by men for decades, and I wasn't sure if I would be accepted, respected, or even allowed to reach my full potential." She paused and smiled at the memory of her younger self, so uncertain and yet so determined to prove herself worthy of the opportunity she had been given. "I want to tell you about a mission I flew over Afghanistan, not because it was particularly heroic or exceptional, but because it taught me something important about what it means to be a warrior. I learned that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to act in spite of fear when others are counting on you. I learned that respect is not given freely. It must be earned through performance under pressure. And I learned that the only opinion that truly matters is the one you have of yourself when you look in the mirror at the end of the day." In the audience, she could see young women whose faces reflected the same determination she had felt as a cadet. She knew that some of them would face discrimination and skepticism, that they would have to work twice as hard to prove themselves, and that they would sometimes wonder if the struggle was worth the cost. But she also knew that they were entering a military that had changed dramatically since her own early career. The barriers were still there, but they were lower and more fragile. The prejudices still existed, but they were increasingly challenged by commanders who valued performance over preconceptions. The question you need to ask yourself is not whether you're good enough, she continued. The question is whether you're willing to do whatever it takes to become good enough. Are you willing to study harder than your peers? Are you willing to accept criticism and use it to improve your performance? Are you willing to risk everything when lives depend on your actions? After her speech, Sarah was approached by a young female cadet who reminded her strongly of herself at that age, serious, determined, and just a little bit uncertain about her future. "General Chen," the cadet said, "I want to fly A-10s just like you did. Do you think I have what it takes?" Sarah looked into the young woman's eyes and saw the same fire that had driven her own career, the same burning desire to prove herself worthy of the trust that would be placed in her. "I think you have exactly what it takes," she replied. "But more importantly, I think you're going to discover that for yourself. And when you do, when you're sitting in the cockpit of an A-10 with someone's life depending on your actions, you'll know that you earned your place there through your own merit and determination." 10 years later, Major General Sarah Chen stood in the Pentagon briefing room where she now served as Director of Air Force Personnel, responsible for the career development and assignment policies that would shape the next generation of Air Force leaders. On her desk was a report that would have been unimaginable when she was a young pilot fighting for acceptance in the Special Operations community. According to the latest statistics, women now comprised 35% of Air Force pilots, and their performance metrics were indistinguishable from their male counterparts. More significantly, the Special Operations community had specifically requested increased integration of female pilots, citing studies that showed mixed-gender aircrew teams performed better under stress than homogeneous teams. The transformation had not been without challenges. There had been scandals and setbacks, moments when progress seemed to stall or even reverse. But the overall trajectory was clear. The military aviation community had moved beyond token integration toward genuine equality of opportunity and responsibility. Sarah's own career had become a case study in how individual performance could change institutional culture. The mission over Afghanistan had been a catalyst, but the real change had come through years of consistent excellence by female pilots who had followed in her wake. Each successful mission, each act of courage under fire, each demonstration of technical competence had weakened the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Her office was filled with memorabilia from her flying career, but the item she treasured most was a simple photograph that sat on her desk. It showed 8 men in combat gear standing next to an A-10 aircraft, and it had been taken during a reunion of Phantom Team 3 years after their mission together. All 8 SEALs had inscribed the photograph with personal messages, but Rodriguez's inscription remained her favorite: "To the warrior who saved our lives and changed our minds. With respect and gratitude always." 15 years later, Lieutenant General Sarah Chen walked through the corridors of the Pentagon for the last time as an active-duty Air Force officer. Tomorrow she would retire after 30 years of service, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond her individual accomplishments as a pilot and commander. The Air Force she was leaving was fundamentally different from the one she had joined. As a young second lieutenant, women now served in every combat role, commanded fighter squadrons and special operations units, and held senior leadership positions throughout the service. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been not just lowered, but eliminated entirely. But perhaps more importantly, the culture had changed. The word tourist had been permanently retired from the vocabulary of military aviation, replaced by a culture that valued performance over prejudice, merit over gender, and courage over conformity. On her final day in uniform, Sarah received a visit from a young major who had just been selected to command an A-10 squadron, the first female pilot to hold that position. "General," the major said, "I wanted to thank you for making this possible. Every female pilot in the Air Force, owes you a debt of gratitude for what you accomplished." Sarah smiled and shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Major. You earned that command through your own skill and dedication. That's exactly how it should be." As she walked out of the Pentagon for the last time, Sarah reflected on the distance she had traveled since that morning over the mountains of Afghanistan when 8 Navy SEALs had been counting on her to save their lives. She had started that mission as an outsider fighting for acceptance. She was ending her career as a leader who had helped transform not just the Air Force, but the entire culture of American military aviation. The word tourist had become a relic of the past, replaced by a new understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Gender had become irrelevant when measured against courage, skill, and commitment to mission accomplishment. And a new generation of pilots, both male and female, were flying missions that would have been unimaginable when she was a young captain trying to prove herself worthy of respect. Years later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the lectern in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, delivering the keynote address at the opening of a new exhibit titled "Breaking Barriers: Women in Combat Aviation." Behind her hung a display featuring her A-10 aircraft, the same Warthog she had flown on that mission over Afghanistan decades earlier, along with aircraft flown by other pioneering female pilots who had helped transform military aviation. In the audience sat hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the changes she and others had fought to achieve. There were female pilots who now commanded squadrons and wings, special operations personnel who had learned to value diversity as a force multiplier, and young girls who saw military aviation as a natural career choice rather than a barrier to overcome. But scattered throughout the audience were also 8 older men wearing SEAL tridents on their civilian suits, members of the original Phantom team who had gathered to honor the pilot, who had saved their lives and changed their understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. "The mission I want to tell you about today," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent museum, was not about proving that women could succeed in combat aviation. It was about proving that courage, skill, and commitment to others are the only qualifications that matter when lives are on the line. She looked out at the faces in the audience and saw the future of American military aviation, diverse, talented, and united by shared values rather than divided by artificial barriers. The word tourist used to be applied to pilots who were seen as visitors in combat aviation rather than true warriors. Today, that word has no meaning in our community because we have learned that warriors come in many forms. What matters is not who you are, but what you're willing to sacrifice for others when everything is on the line. As the exhibition opened to the public, children pressed their faces against the glass cases containing flight helmets, medals, and photographs from missions that had shaped the history of military aviation. Among them was a young girl who spent long minutes staring at the display about Sarah's mission over Afghanistan, reading every word of the description that explained how one pilot's courage had helped change an entire culture. The girl's grandmother, standing beside her, noticed her fascination with the exhibit. "What do you think about that story?" the grandmother asked. The girl looked up with eyes bright with possibility. "I think she was brave. And I think I want to be a pilot like her someday." The grandmother smiled, remembering a time when such a statement would have been met with skepticism or discouragement. But those days were gone, swept away by pioneers who had proven that the sky belonged to anyone with the courage to claim it. "I think you can be anything you want to be," the grandmother replied. "And I think she would be proud to know that girls like you see her as an example of what's possible." As visitors moved through the exhibit, they encountered stories of dozens of female pilots who had followed Sarah's example, each building on the foundation she had helped establish. There were fighter pilots who had led combat missions, test pilots who had broken speed and altitude records, and airline captains who had inspired new generations of aviators. But at the center of the exhibit, in a place of honor, stood the display about a single mission over the mountains of Afghanistan, where 8 Navy SEALs had been pinned down by enemy fire and a female. A-10 pilot had chosen to risk everything to save their lives. The placard beside the display included a quote from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez that had become famous in military aviation circles. "She didn't do this because she had to. She did it because that's who she is. She's a warrior, and the sky is where she belongs." And in smaller text at the bottom of the display, barely visible unless someone looked closely, was a line that captured the true legacy of that mission. The word tourist was permanently retired from the vocabulary of military aviation on this day, replaced by a new understanding that courage has no gender. 25 years after that fateful mission over Afghanistan, the mountains looked the same. The same jagged peaks, the same brown and ochre landscape, the same sense of isolation that had made it such a perfect killing ground for Taliban fighters, who understood how to use terrain to their advantage. But everything else had changed. General Sarah Chen, now 62 years old and serving as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first woman to hold that position, stood in the open door of a V-22 Osprey as it approached the coordinates where 8 Navy SEALs had once been pinned down by enemy fire. Today, those same coordinates marked the location of a new forward operating base that bore an unusual name, Camp Viper. The base had been established as part of a multinational training facility where American Special Operations Forces worked, alongside allied units to share tactics and build relationships that would endure long after the current conflicts ended. But the name held special significance for the men and women who served there, and for the broader special operations community that had chosen to honor a pilot who had redefined what it meant to be a warrior. "2 minutes out, General," called the crew chief over the aircraft's intercom system. Sarah nodded and checked her watch. The timing was precise because everything about today's ceremony had been planned with military precision. In exactly 1 hour, she would deliver the dedication speech for a new memorial that would honor all the pilots who had given their lives in support of special operations missions. But before that formal ceremony, she had a more personal appointment. To keep Dot as the Osprey touched down on the base's landing pad, Sarah could see a familiar figure waiting near the edge of the tarmac. Command Sergeant Major Marcus Rodriguez, now 58 years old and nearing his own retirement after 35 years of service, stood at attention in his dress uniform. The ribbons on his chest told the story of a career that had taken him to every corner of the world where American Special Operations Forces had been called upon to serve. But despite all the missions he had completed and all the dangers he had faced in the decade since Afghanistan, Rodriguez still carried the coin that Sarah had given him 25 years earlier, the same coin he had presented to her after she had saved his team's lives. "General Chen," he said, rendering a crisp salute as she approached. "Marcus," she replied, returning the salute before extending her hand. "It's good to see you again." They walked together toward a small outcropping of rocks that had been preserved as part of the memorial complex. It was here, according to military historians who had studied the battle, that Rodriguez's team had made their final defensive stand, while Sarah had flown repeated gun runs to keep them alive. "Hard to believe it's been 25 years, Rodriguez said as they stood looking out over the landscape where their lives had intersected in such dramatic fashion. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Sarah replied. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, two warriors who had shared an experience that had changed both of their lives in profound ways. Sarah thought about the path that had brought her to this moment, from the uncertain young pilot who had been dismissed as a tourist to the senior military leader who now helped shape policy for the entire Department of Defense. "You know," Rodriguez said eventually, "I never properly thanked you for what you did that day." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Marcus, you've thanked me 100 times over the years. You wrote the recommendation that got me the distinguished Flying Cross, you spoke at my promotion ceremonies. You've been one of my strongest supporters throughout my entire career. That's not what I mean, Rodriguez replied. I never thanked you for teaching me that I was wrong about what makes someone a warrior. I spent the first 15 years of my career thinking that courage and competence were somehow related to gender, that women couldn't be trusted to make the hard decisions when lives were on the line. He paused and looked directly into her eyes. You didn't just save my team that day, Sarah. You saved me from becoming the kind of leader who would have missed out on working with some of the finest warriors I've ever known simply because they were women. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her throat. Even after all these years, even after all the recognition and advancement she had achieved, it still meant something profound to hear those words from the man whose respect had been so important to earning acceptance in the special operations community. The funny thing is, she said, I thought I was fighting to prove myself to you and people like you. But I realize now that I was really fighting to prove something to myself. I needed to know that when everything was on the line, when lives depended on my actions, I would have the courage to do what needed to be done. And now? Rodriguez asked. Now I know that courage isn't something you prove once and then possess forever. It's something you have to choose again and again, every time you're faced with a decision between the safe path and the right path. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of another figure, a young woman in Air Force flight suit, who was jogging toward them across the tarmac. As she drew closer, Sarah could see the captain's bars on her uniform and the distinctive patches that identified her as an A-10 pilot. General Chen? The young woman called out as she approached. I'm Captain Lisa Washington. I'm the pilot who's going to be flying the heritage demonstration for today's ceremony. Sarah smiled as she recognized something familiar in the young captain's demeanor, the same mixture of determination and nervousness that she remembered from her own early career. Captain Washington, she replied, I've heard excellent things about your flying. Your squadron commander tells me you're one of the best close air support pilots he's ever seen. The captain's face flushed with pride and embarrassment. Thank you, ma'am. I have to say, it's an honor to be flying on the same day that you're here. Every A-10 pilot knows the story of your mission over these mountains. What do you know about that mission? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about how the story had evolved over the years. Well, ma'am, we study it in training as an example of tactical decision-making under pressure. But for female pilots, it means something more than that. Captain Washington paused, choosing her words carefully. It means that we don't have to apologize for being here. We don't have to prove that we're as good as male pilots. We just have to prove that we're good pilots. Rodriguez chuckled softly. That's exactly what she proved that day, Captain. And she's been proving it ever since. As they walked toward the memorial site where the dedication ceremony would take place, Sarah reflected on how much the military aviation community had changed her early career. Captain Washington represented something that would have been unimaginable 25 years earlier, a female pilot who had never experienced serious discrimination, who had been judged solely on her performance, and who saw combat aviation as a natural career choice, rather than a barrier to overcome. The memorial itself was a testament to how completely the culture had transformed. The centerpiece was a bronze statue of an A-10 aircraft in a steep attack dive, but the plaques surrounding it honored pilots of all genders who had given their lives in support of special operations missions. There were no separate categories or qualifications, just warriors who had served with distinction. As the ceremony began, Sarah found herself looking out at an audience that included hundreds of active duty personnel representing every branch of the military. In the front rows sat members of various special operations units, including several teams that were now commanded by women, who had followed the path she had helped establish. But scattered throughout the audience were also the faces that mattered most to her, the original members of Phantom Team, now gray-haired and bearing the marks of careers spent in the world's most dangerous places, but still carrying themselves with the bearing of elite warriors. When she stepped to the podium to deliver the dedication speech, Sarah felt the weight of 25 years of change and progress. But she also felt the presence of all the women who had come before her, and all those who would follow in the years to come. 25 years ago, she began, I flew a mission over these mountains that changed my life and in some small way helped change the culture of military aviation. I was called a tourist by people who thought that women had no place in combat roles. Today, I stand before you as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, surrounded by female pilots, special operations personnel, and military leaders who have proven that courage and competence have no gender. She paused and looked directly at Rodriguez, who was sitting with his team in the front row. But this memorial is not about breaking barriers or proving points. It's about honoring the men and women who made the ultimate sacrifice while serving something greater than themselves. It's about remembering that being a warrior is not about who you are, but about what you're willing to sacrifice for others. The dedication ceremony concluded with a flyover by 4 A-10 aircraft led by Captain Washington, who executed a perfect missing man formation over the memorial site. As Sarah watched the aircraft disappear into the Afghan sky, she was struck by how completely the circle had been closed. The young woman flying that A-10 would never be called tourist. She would never have to prove that she belonged in the cockpit of a combat aircraft. She would be judged solely on her performance, her courage, and her commitment to the mission. That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave Afghanistan for what would likely be the last time in her military career, she received an unexpected visit from Rodriguez. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket to pull out a familiar object. It was the SEAL Team coin he had given her 25 years earlier, but now it showed the wear and patina of decades of handling. I want you to keep this, he said. Not because you saved our lives that day, but because you represent everything this coin stands for: courage, sacrifice, and commitment to your teammates. Sarah accepted the coin with a sense of emotion that surprised her. After all these years, after all the recognition and advancement she had achieved, this simple gesture from an old friend still had the power to move her. Thank you, Marcus. This means more to me than any medal or promotion ever could. It should, Rodriguez replied, because it means that you're family. And family looks out for each other, no matter what. As her aircraft lifted off from Camp Viper and turned toward home, Sarah looked down at the mountains where her life had been forever changed. The landscape looked the same, but everything else was different. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had been not just lowered, but eliminated entirely. The word tourist had been permanently retired from the vocabulary of military aviation, replaced by a culture that valued performance over prejudice and courage over conformity. But perhaps most importantly, a new generation of warriors, both male and female, was serving in roles that would have been unimaginable when she was a young pilot fighting for acceptance. They would face new challenges and overcome new obstacles, but they would do so as equals in every sense of the word. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had not set out to be a pioneer or to change military culture. She had simply wanted to be the best pilot she could be and to serve her country with distinction. But in pursuing those simple goals, she had helped transform an entire institution and had opened doors for generations of warriors who would follow in her wake. The mission was complete. The transformation was permanent. And the sky belonged to anyone with the courage to claim it. 30 years after that mission over Afghanistan, Captain Jennifer Martinez, granddaughter of one of the original Phantom team members, stood in the briefing room at Bagram Air Base, preparing for her first close air support mission as an A-10 pilot. On the wall behind her hung a photograph that had been taken 3 decades earlier, 8 Navy SEALs standing, next to an A-10 aircraft with a handwritten inscription that read, "To the warrior who saved our lives and changed our minds." As she reviewed her mission briefing, Captain Martinez realized that she was about to fly over the same mountains where her grandfather's life had been saved by a pilot who had refused to accept the label of tourist. But for Captain Martinez and her generation, that history was simply background context. She had never been called a tourist. She had never had to prove that women belonged in combat aviation. She had been judged solely on her abilities from the day she entered pilot training. As she walked toward her aircraft, Captain Martinez carried with her the legacy of all the pioneers who had made her career possible. But she also carried something more important, the knowledge that she belonged in the cockpit of that A-10. Not because of politics or social engineering, but because she had earned her place there through skill, determination, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. The word tourist had become a historical curiosity, a relic of a time when barriers existed where none should have been. In its place was a new understanding of what it meant to be a warrior, one that was based on character rather than characteristics, on performance rather than prejudice. As Captain Martinez started her engines and prepared for takeoff, she carried with her the hopes and dreams of every young person who had ever looked up at the sky and wondered if they had what it takes to touch the infinite blue. The answer, proven by 30 years of precedent, was simple. If you have the courage to try, the determination to persist, and the willingness to sacrifice for others, then the sky is exactly where you belong. The mission continues. The barriers are gone, and the legacy of those who fought to eliminate them lives on in every warrior who follows their example. The E&D. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story of Major Sarah Viper Chen and her transformation from tourist to warrior, you've just experienced what we do here every week, bringing you incredible true stories of courage, determination, and the human spirit. Subscribe for more amazing stories. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of listeners who appreciate untold military stories that showcase extraordinary courage under pressure, breaking barrier narratives featuring pioneers who changed history, in-depth character studies of real heroes you've never heard of, professionally narrated tales that bring these moments to life. You'll get when you subscribe. New episodes every week featuring different military branches and time periods, exclusive bonus content, including interviews with veterans and military historians, behind-the-scenes insights into how these stories are researched and verified, notifications so you never miss a new release. Connect with our community. Ring the notification bell to be alerted when new episodes drop. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Suggest story topics you'd like us to cover next. Share these stories with friends and family who appreciate military history or support matters. Every subscription helps us research and verify more incredible stories, improve our production quality, reach new audiences who need to hear these tales of courage. Honor the service members whose stories deserve to be told. Subscribe now and become part of a community that believes some stories are too important to be forgotten. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And thank you for helping us share these stories of extraordinary, ordinary people who did extraordinary things when it mattered most. Subscribe, like, share, comment. Extraordinary things when it mattered most. Subscribe, like, share, mattered most.